Hello, beautiful. We're going to read some Mr. Men books tonight. Mr. Mischief by Roger Hargreaves. We'll read this one first. Poor Mr. Happy had had a tiring day, rushing here and there and back. Everywhere, cheering people up was very hard work. Phew, he sighed as he went into his house and sat down for a well-earned rest on a kitchen chair. But then, do you know what happened? Oh, the chair fell to bits. Bump went poor Mr. Happy. Oh, that's all I need, he said. I rather think that I have had a visit from Mr. Mischief. And he was right. Outside Mr. Happy's house and running away as fast as his little legs would carry him was a small, mischievous figure, Mr. Mischief. Oh, mischief, glorious mischief, he cried. I do so love it. And he ran, giggling, into the night. The next morning there was a knock at Mr. Greedy's front door, but when he went to answer it, there was no one there. But what was there was a box. And inside the box was a large chocolate cake filled with cream and the most delicious-looking pink icing. Mr. Greedy's eyes gleamed. He licked his lips and shut his eyes and opened his mouth. Then he took a large bite. Ah! The chocolate wasn't chocolate. It was mud. The cream inside wasn't cream. It was cotton wool. And the delicious-looking pink icing wasn't icing at all. Oh, it was toothpaste. Ugh. Outside Mr. Greedy's house and running away as fast as his little legs would carry him was a small, mischievous figure, giggling as he ran. That's not all. That very same morning, Mr. Funny discovered that someone had filled his hat with treacle. Very sticky treacle. Can you guess who that someone might have been? However, that very same afternoon, Mr. Mischief did something that he was to regret. He was walking along through the woods looking for mischief when he came across a wizard. A sleeping wizard. I know, giggled Mr. Mischief. I'll change the wizard's wand for an ordinary piece of wood, and then he can't do any magic. He grinned a mischievous grin and crept quietly towards the slumbering wizard. Mr. Mischief reached carefully out and seized the wizard's magic wand. But what he didn't know was that the wizard's wand did not like to be seized. Help! Help! Shrieked the wand in a high, shrill voice and awakened the wizard, who in turn seized Mr. Mischief by the nose, which was extremely painful. Let go of my nose, cried Mr. Mischief. I know who you are, said the wizard. You're that Mr. Mischief who sawed through poor Mr. Happy's chair legs and baked a rather unusual cake for Mr. Greedy. And, he went on, put treacle in poor Mr. Funny's hat. I've been hearing all about you, he added. Let go of my nose, cried Mr. Mischief again. Very well, said the wizard, but don't believe that you can get away with being as mischievous as that. And, as he let go of Mr. Mischief's nose, he got hold of his magic wand and waved it. Beware, he said, and went off. Silly wizard, muttered Mr. Mischief. Can't you take a joke? Silly wizard. And he went home. Silly wizard, he said again, as he sat down in his kitchen chair. Bump! Oh, silly, silly, silly wizard, groaned Mr. Mischief, picking himself up. Him and his silly magic. And he made himself some porridge for tea. Mmm, smiled Mr. Mischief as he put a large spoonful of porridge into his mouth. Ah! Somehow, as if by magic, which of course it was, the porridge had turned into sawdust. Oh dear, spluttered Mr. Mischief. Perhaps I had better not get up to quite so much mischief in future. And he went upstairs. He jumped into the bed. Splosh! The bed was full of raspberry jam. Oh dear, sighed Mr. Mischief. I think I definitely must not get up to quite so much mischief in the future. And do you know something? The day after, he was as good as gold. And the next day. And the day after that. It lasted a week. And then that old mischievous urge got the better of him. He just couldn't help himself. It was a Saturday night, and he crept into Mr. Fussy's house while he was fast asleep. And can you guess what he did? Oh, what a beautiful piece of perfect mischief, he cried as he ran home giggling. He'd cut off half of Mr. Fussy's moustache. Isn't that terrible? Poor Mr. Fussy. He was absolutely horrified when he woke up and found out. But even that terrible piece of mischief is not the end of Mr. Mischief's story. So, before you go to bed, just take a look out of the window. Go on. You can't see a small mischievous figure anywhere, can you? Can you? Are you sure? Mr. Fussy. Mr. Fussy was fussy about everything. Absolutely everything had to be neat and tidy and in its proper place. Mr. Fussy spent all day every day rearranging his furniture, making sure the flowers grew in a straight line, trying to find specks of dust where there couldn't possibly be specks of dust, because he spent all of his time making sure that there weren't any specks of dust. One fine morning, Mr. Fussy was having breakfast. He was very fussy about what he ate. He opened the marmalade pot. "Oh!" he exclaimed. "It's got bits in it." So he spent the rest of the morning separating the bits from the marmalade, or, if you prefer, the marmalade from the bits. Fussy old fusspot, people used to call him. Then Mr. Fussy went out into his garden and spent the rest of his day straightening out all the blades of grass on his lawn. Oh, funny old fusspot. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, ironing his shoelaces, when he heard a crash outside. "What's to do?" he muttered to himself, and hurried outside to investigate. There, with a broken garden gate in his hand, and an old battered suitcase in the other, and a sheepish grin on his face, stood a very untidy person. "Mr. Clumsy!" "Whoops," he said, holding the garden gate. "It just came off in my hand." Spluttered Mr. Fussy, looking in horror at his garden gate. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Clumsy," replied the untidy person. Grinning, he stepped forward to shake Mr. Fussy's hand, but tripped over and fell on the lawn. My grass!" cried Mr. Fussy. "My straight grass! You've bent it!" And he got down on his hands and knees and started to straighten the grass. "But who are you?" he asked over his shoulder. And why are you here? I'm your cousin, replied Mr. Clumsy. Your long-lost cousin from Australia, and I've come to visit. Aren't you pleased to see me? Continued Mr. Clumsy cheerfully, knocking over a flower or two as he got up. He picked up his suitcase, knocking over another flower or two or three. Mr. Fussy quite obviously was not pleased to see him. Oh, you'd better come in, he muttered. I say, remarked Mr. Clumsy, looking through the front door of Mr. Fussy's house. I say, what a neat and tidy little place you've got here. And he stepped inside, tripped over his shoelaces, as he often does, knocked over a chair, dropped his suitcase, and fell in an untidy heap on the floor. Whoops, he said. Mr. Fussy shut his eyes and heaved a sigh and groaned silently to himself. Later that evening, after Mr. Fussy had cooked them a meal and after Mr. Clumsy had helped with the washing up, well, broken 2 plates, they sat down to talk. Mr. Fussy sat, as he always did, in a neat and tidy fashion. Mr. Clumsy sat, as he always did, in a not-so-neat and tidy fashion. So how long are you staying? Asked Mr. Fussy. Oh, I don't know. A few days, a week, a year? I haven't decided. When he awoke in the morning, Mr. Fussy jumped out of bed and went into his bathroom. Oh, no, he gasped. Oh, no. Oh, yes. Mr. Clumsy had been there before him. The towels lay in a heap on the floor. The bath was full of water. There were pools of water all over the bathroom and half a tube of toothpaste. What a mess. Mr. Fussy made it all neat and tidy as quickly as he possibly could. Then Mr. Fussy hurried downstairs. Morning, said his cousin cheerfully. I've cooked you some breakfast. Sit down. There was an awful mess everywhere. There we are, said Mr. Clumsy, carrying a plate of fried eggs, or broken fried eggs, towards the table. Breakfast! And then he tripped over those shoelaces of his, and then the eggs flew through the air, and then they landed all over poor Mr. Fussy. Sticky, greasy, yellow fried eggs. Whoops, said Mr. Clumsy. After a week, Mr. Fussy's house didn't look like Mr. Fussy's house at all anymore. But after 2 weeks, Mr. Clumsy decided to move on. Thank you for having me, he said to Mr. Fussy. It was very, very nice to see you, replied Mr. Fussy. But what he was thinking was, it's very nice to see you leave. Cheerio, said Mr. Clumsy, and off he went with his battered old suitcase. Goodbye, called Mr. Fussy, really meaning good riddance. Then, after he was gone, Mr. Fussy fussed around his house as he had never fussed before. Fussy old fusspot. Polishing and mending, repairing and straightening, sorting out and cleaning, and putting everything back exactly as it has been before Mr. Clumsy had come to stay. He even dusted the flowers in the garden. That evening Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, polishing an egg, when he heard a crash outside. Oh no, he groaned. Not Mr. Clumsy back again. It can't be. It mustn't be. It isn't. And it wasn't. It was somebody else. Somebody who had just walked straight through Mr. Fussy's garden gate. Somebody who can't help having little accidents. Somebody you might have met before. Hello, smiled Mr. Bump. I've come to visit.